Science. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here today for the inaugural lecture of Siddhartha Bandyopadhyay. Sid is an internationally recognized economist in the field of political economy and public policy, with a particular interest in the economic evaluation of public policy and the economics of crime. His research has dealt with questions in political economy, around electoral systems and coalition formation, as well as around the rise of extremism during periods of political pessimism. And I have to say we're experiencing one of those periods right now, so this couldn't be more opportune. He also researches in public policy, looking in particular at crime policy and how it gets mediated through the political process. Sid's work has been published in top academic journals, but also is highly impactful beyond academia. His paper on the electoral incentives of prosecutors with Brian McCannon was awarded the Duncan Black Prize for the best paper by the prestigious Public Choice Society in 2015. This paper is an example of his dual interest in political economy and the working of the criminal justice system. He's also director of the Multidisciplinary Centre for Crime, Justice and Policing at the university and leads the 21st Century Transnational Crime theme for the Institute of Global Innovation. These are vehicles for his genuinely innovative and deep relationships with practitioners. For example, he's worked closely with a number of police forces to promote a culture of evidence-based policing. This work is transforming police investigation and forms the core of one of the business school's impact case studies for the next ref, and indeed has also been shortlisted recently for a COS Impact Prize. Sid is truly also an interdisciplinary scholar. In addition to regularly publishing in economics journals, he's also published in highly ranked journals in political science, law, criminology, and medicine. Over the last few years, he's worked closely with Professor Jessica Woodhams in the School of Psychology and a number of other scholars in psychology, law, public health, and nursing on funded projects on policing and criminal justice interventions. His most recent funded project was confirmed just 2 weeks ago, and I understand from Sid that it's already started with another £650,000 from the College of Policing. And outside of his work, I'm told that Sid likes to keep fit by playing tennis and belongs to a book club and enjoys exploring the culinary delights of Birmingham. Now, I believe that those of you in the audience may represent some of those constituencies of Sid's work, his research collaborators, his students, maybe also his tennis partners. And I would also like to extend a particular welcome to Sid's parents, who've flown all the way from Calcutta to be here tonight. So we're very pleased indeed to have you with us. So tonight, Sid will look at the causes and effects of polarization and the rise of electoral success of politicians with extremist views. He will explore whether this is correlated with the availability of multiple channels, including social media outlets, through which citizens can get information, and whether this contributes to the rise of echo chambers. And with that, can I just say that tonight we are live streaming on Facebook, one of those social media channels, and we would encourage you to tweet throughout the lecture with the hashtag COSInaug. And with no further ado, I will pass you over to Sid.
Well, thank you, Richard, for your kind introduction, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to talk to you about something which I've been thinking of for a very long time. And this thinking has made me realize that what we term as polarization about policy positions, say, do you support Brexit or do you support electing Trump, and so on and so forth, are really emanate from differences in policy beliefs about the state of the world. And hopefully, by the time I end, you'll have a better understanding of what I mean by differences in policy beliefs across states of the world. This was driven home to me on my recent visit to India in Christmas. I talked to a left liberal lawyer friend of mine, and she told me that things are really bad. Why? Because the present government is basically overturning the secular constitutional structure of India and sort of undoing all the years which has made India the diverse country that it is. Right. That's one viewpoint. The next day, as it happened, I was talking to a right-wing nationalist cousin of mine, and he told me that after years of left-wing propaganda, finally people were seeing an alternate viewpoint, and finally, in addition to economic progress, India was reliving and rediscovering its past glory. Now, I have to say that I don't even want to get into where the truth lies, but I was wondering, A, where do these beliefs come from, these extremely polar beliefs? And B, what would happen if these two people talk to each other? Okay? So that, in a sense, gives you a flavor of the type of things that I'm going to talk about today. But before we even get into that, and I have to say, that's one of the sort of advantages of giving this kind of an inaugural lecture, is I can now make a lot of conjectures about things that I don't necessarily have to prove rigorously. And yeah, it's a one-time opportunity, and I'm going to use that. But I'll start with a couple of things that we already know, including some recent work that I've done, before I move into the realm of speculation. So let me just go back a bit and talk about, right, there should be a clicker. Yes. And talk about Voting Theory 101. Voting Theory 101 has this celebrated median voter theorem, which says that politicians and therefore policies gravitate towards the middle because they want to sort of be concerned with the preferences of the median voter, and that's a winning strategy. It's particularly true when there are two parties, as you have in the UK or the US and in a number of other countries. And you see that, right, in the rise of New Labour, which came to the center and then after years of being out of power, came into power. And you see that all over the world. At the same time, completely contrary to the median voter theorem, you see the recent electoral success of politicians who've espoused extreme, and by extreme I mean away from the median policies. And in countries as diverse as India, US, and Brazil. So none of these leaders who were elected are known for their centrist or moderate policies. Now, why is that? Now, one explanation, of course, could be that, look, society is polarized, so there's a vanishing middle or median. Instead, there are sort of bunches of voters who matter at the two extremes, and politicians are simply latching on to one or the other. And you can actually see that. I mean, Labour has now again moved to the left, so even politicians who don't win are kind of moving away from the center. So that could be one possible explanation, which might explain the sort of supposed lack of influence now of the median voter. Possible. Now that, of course, begs the question of why is society so polarized? I mean, have things changed over time in some ways which has caused society to become more polarized? Now, a popular explanation, and though I'll kind of mostly run with this explanation, I'll point out that there are competing viewpoints on this, is that the rise of media, so the rise of, I would say, a choice of media outlets, including social media, allows the perpetuation of echo chambers. So if you only had like 2 or 3 national dailies from which you get your news, and they are kind of more or less centrist, then whether you like it or not, you're exposed to different viewpoints. So even if you're left liberal, you might hear news which do not necessarily conform to your beliefs, and so on and so forth. But today you don't need to. You don't need to read any, central national daily. You pick an outlet that sort of is consonant with your beliefs. And by the way, this affects both the choice of news. So you pick an outlet. If you want to, if you're left liberal and you want to learn about the sort of catastrophe of global warming, not only do you pick news media that covers that, but you also pick a news media where the slant is towards an ideology or which confirms to your existing view. And the fact that we have countless sources, therefore, ironically, even though we could become information rich if we could use these countless sources, actually makes us information poor, because we only pick those things which, I'm not saying we necessarily do, but we could end up choosing those things which conform to our existing bias. And why is it ironic? Because potentially there are these countless new sources, and you could, through a careful reading, actually verify and find out the truth about competing claims. But as they say, to find one must seek. Do we seek? Here's an example. Now, I imagine most of you don't have this odd hobby that I do of following the US Supreme Court and its judgments and so on and so forth. So you might not recognize this, but this is the late Antonin Scalia, a conservative stalwart who died suddenly in Obama's last year in office. And it's a different issue that there was this bitter fight where the Republicans would let his successor be confirmed and so on and so forth. That's for another day. But here's an interview with the late Justice Scalia. He says, "What's your media diet? Where do you get your news?" He said, "Well, we get newspapers in the morning." What a surprise. We? Meaning the justice says, no, Maureen is Antonin Scalia's wife. Maureen and I usually skim them. We just get the Wall Street Journal, which is sort of center-right, Washington Times, about the same, a bit more right perhaps. We used to get the Washington Post, which is a left liberal newspaper, but it just went too far for me. I couldn't handle it anymore. What tipped you over the edge? Why did he not read the Washington Times anymore? The treatment of almost any conservative issue. It is slanted and often nasty. And this is important. Why should I wake up and get upset every morning by reading news which makes me angry? There's absolutely no need to do that. And therefore, I just stopped reading such news and instead read things in which sort of, most news agrees with my sort of prior beliefs. Now, this is from Justice Scalia, an erudite scholar and a judge who you would think would welcome independent thinking and so on and so forth. But is it any wonder that a lot of ordinary citizens also follow Justice Scalia and only consume news that conforms to their bias, and therefore their media consumption could confirm bias, as we only read what we want? Now, many people, of course, think that this is sort of a recent phenomenon with the rise of competing channels and social media and so on and so forth. But to be fair, we were warned about this to an extent by two researchers as early as 1996 from MIT, which says that individuals empowered to screen out material that does not conform to their existing preferences may form virtual cliques, insulate themselves from opposing points of view, reinforce their bias. Internet users can seek out interactions with like-minded individuals who have similar values and thus become less likely to trust important decisions to people whose values differ from their own. Now, I have to say this is not a viewpoint which is universally shared. I think it's a reasonably likely explanation for some of the polarization that we see, but it's not universally shared. And in fact, some argue that social media, in fact, widens exposure, and even if it is sort of accidental exposure in a way, you kind of, it does sometimes bring you in contact with views other than your own, which may actually help worsen bias. So I'm perfectly aware that there's also a sort of alternate or minority viewpoint on this, which is important, that sometimes actually social media can make you find the truth if you have the sort of interest in learning about various viewpoints. However, while certainly a good explanation is that polarized voters give rise to polarized politicians and therefore polarized policies, is it necessary that voting groups have to be polarized in order for policies to be extreme? And again, by extreme, let me once again clarify, I mean away from the median. The answer is, turns out, and this is not speculation, this is one part where we've actually, based on work that I've done, which is not pure speculation? The answer is no. In recent work that I've done with Kalyan Chatterjee at Penn State and Joydeep Roy at the University of Bath, we show that extreme policies and politicians who espouse extreme policies can be electorally successful even in a completely homogeneous society. I mean, to take an extreme example, in our model, we take a one-voter economy which has, so that, or a bunch of identical voters, and suppose they're at some policy position, you'd think the natural answer is that if there's only one voter, then shouldn't every politician who wants to win be at that voter's ideal policy? And the answer is no. And the reason is because voters care not just for policy on which there are policy differences, but they care for other things like character of a politician, honesty, and so on and so forth. And strangely enough, this extremism in the policy space signals to the voters something about the competence or the honesty of a politician. So the basic idea is that, look, only a politician who is sort of honest, is just not pandering to the voter, would ever want to take a policy with which voters don't agree, right? I mean, so why would if he only want to win? And therefore, in a regime of political pessimism, that is when you're basically fed up with the political class, which is sort of a phase that we're going through now, a voter would consider voting for this challenger who has taken an extreme policy. But at the same time, this voter wants to be sure that actually the challenger is in fact competent, honest, and so on and so forth, and therefore would try to seek out news or demand news from media. And the media would respond by providing more news, and mind you, some of the news could be true, some of the news could be false. If you're really, really interested, I'll be more than happy to send you a link to the paper. And therefore, the demand for news would increase in sort of extremism up to a point. I mean, if the politician takes a totally crazy policy, well, yeah, fine. You won't vote for her. But up to a point, you actually want to vote for this bold politician who does not pander to your ideal policy. And therefore, you end up sometimes voting for a politician because you think he's otherwise competent and honest. And this, as I pointed out, occurs during the times of political pessimism, which is often correlated with an economy in recession. Right? So that's, if you like, an empirically testable hypothesis that comes out of our model. And as a result, you suffer extreme policies which are the price of selecting, if you like, leaders with competence and so on and so forth. Now, I could point out that in environments less drastic than ours, that is one in which there's a homogeneous society and so on and so forth, it's still true that you could get extreme policies which could help select competent leaders. The cost of that is it drives policy away from the median voter, but it also has a dynamic effect. Dynamically, it favors, especially, I mean, in times of conflict and so on, politicians who are inherently hawkish in a way. In other words, those who are sort of aggressive in negotiations and so on and so forth, who might go to war more easily than others. So there is a dynamics of the selection of extreme leaders which can last beyond a single period and bias the process in favor of politicians with certain types of ideology. And therefore, it can lead to certain bad outcomes like the perpetuation of conflict, particularly land disputes between neighboring countries and so on and so forth. Right? So, two things to take away from here. One is you don't need a polarized electorate to elect politicians with extreme policies. Second, if you do, there's a cost of this kind of selection. You suffer extreme policies, and in certain types of issues where the extreme policies, say, negotiation over land and so on and so forth. This can lead to the perpetuation of conflict, which has social costs. Now, as you know, typically economists like to express everything in very elegant equations, and I'm sure you'd have wanted to know what this would have looked like. So this is when we translate all our work, which I've kind of told you in words, to equations. This is what it looks like. I'm sure this is absolutely fascinating, no? Okay. Slightly more accessible. Here's a picture, and believe me, you'll know it. You generally get exactly what I'm talking about. So what we are trying to, so remember we said that during a time of political pessimism, when you're fed up with the incumbent political class, you want to consider voting for a competent challenger who might have an extreme policy. Okay? So we want to see, so we want to understand the hypothesized quality of a challenger if it turns out to be of high quality. Okay, so some expectation about, yeah, the challenger might be actually quite competent. So here's on the vertical axis, you have the probability that your challenger is competent, high quality, that is better than the incumbent. Yeah, and this tells me the ratio of how much better a challenger is compared to the incumbent. So you can see that's only when the challenger is not too much better than the incumbent, even if she was of high quality, that extremism no longer prevails, and instead you have more centrist policies winning. In every other situation, you have the possibility of a political scenario where even with a completely homogeneous society, you have extreme policies. So this, if you like, is our kind of benchmark situation, and it seems to correlate with the fact that, you know, we have elected extreme leaders at a time of political pessimism. How do things change? So back to polarization, and now I'm going to get, as I said, in the realm of conjectures. Interesting conjectures, I hope, but nonetheless things that I haven't proved, but I either hope to prove or I hope that other people will prove. So is it the case that when you actually have a polarized electorate, these things get worse? So you get even more extreme policies and so on and so forth? Or are there some forces which actually bring us more towards centrism in a polarized electorate? Now, to do an analysis of this, there are a few conceptual issues, and that's mostly what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the lecture. Some conceptual issues that you need to understand. First of all, what do we mean by polarization? Well, of course, you could talk about ideological polarization, right? So, you know, you might believe in a more equal society versus you might believe in that society should give incentives to the person who works hard, and therefore equality per se is not desirable. If anything, inequality makes society grow. So those are ideological polarization. You may believe that in general the government should not interfere in personal choices, versus you might think that the state has a role in promoting, say, family values and so on and so forth. So this is a kind of ideological polarization. So if your beliefs are very far apart in this dimension, you have ideological polarization. I think conceptually we should distinguish between this and polarization in beliefs. And I would argue that ideological polarization often arises because of a polarization in beliefs. That your belief about the state of the world is different. So you might believe that an unequal society is better because you believe on some evidence that you have, which is partial, that unequal societies are what incentivizes people to work hard. You might believe that an equal society doesn't leave much incentives for people who work hard and are productive. Now, how far that belief is true is a different issue. But the reason why one person may believe that actually societal inequality is quite okay and we shouldn't really worry about it, versus others who think it's actually not okay. If anything, it leads to concentration of wealth and perpetuation of oligarchies and so on, comes because the sort of information, partially revealing information that comes to you from different sources varies, leading to huge divergences in beliefs, right? So my claim is that it's these divergences in beliefs that perpetuates divergence in ideology, okay? And such polarization, if with such polarization in beliefs, there is no clear way that your beliefs are going to converge, even though I'm going to talk about one or two mechanisms which could cause these beliefs to converge, even when there actually is quite clearly a true state of the world. To give you a very, very absurd example, if you believe that the earth is flat, right, and you only read media outlets, and by the way, there is a flat earth group and they're doing a lot of fundraising if you want to help, right, okay? So if you believe that the earth is flat and you only end up in talking to people who believe that the earth is flat, then even when it's very clearly that the truth exists and the earth is not flat, your beliefs may never converge to that, okay? Why? Because as I said, to converge, meaningful information exchange needs to take place, but there's a chance it will not. Well, why? Well, of course, you could be like the late Justice Scalia and many others. You only read newspaper outlets that sort of confirm to your beliefs. And as I've mentioned before, and I want to emphasize this point, that mobility, not just physical mobility, that you can move and, to a place which is sort of more in consonance with your values, but today online mobility, in other words, you can create your virtual society, right, where most of them believe in the kind of things that you do, whether it's the flat earth theory or something less absurd. And this, ironically, has been helped by globalization and immigration waves in many countries. Why? Because this allows us to consort with people of our kind. So if you can't find somebody in our community, well, we find somebody else online, or because of globalization and the internet and so on. Or if you have mass immigration waves, often there is no meaningful exchange between the two populations, the immigrants who come in and those who don't, because, what's the point? I've got lots of fellow immigrants to talk to, and so on and so forth. And therefore, this sort of perpetuation of beliefs can actually be increased because of changes that are occurring in the world today. Now, one very simple solution people always talk about is communication. If we only talked to each other, things would be okay. So the question that I want to ask is, does communication help? Well, of course it can. I mean, there are papers, in many areas, including economics, which talk about talk and cheap talk and so on and so forth, showing that costless communication can help. But it doesn't necessarily help if the initial priors about the state of the world or the initial beliefs are very far apart. Sometimes, and there is a body of research showing that, sometimes third-party mediation can help. So you have a third person who kind of mediates on your behalf and tries to get people to think through and reach some kind of consensus. That sometimes can help. But if anything, there is also work showing that third-party mediation can sometimes worsen polarization and lead to conflict. And I'm going to talk a little bit about conflict towards the end, but so it's not clear from what we know that whether communication helps and when does communication help. And in particular, what we know from the literature on strategic interaction suggests that communication can only help if your initial priors are not too far apart. Okay, so now let's see if this works or not. Here's an example of communication. Right, let's try this. Any idea? I always knew that I was technologically challenged, but
What is Swami's situation? Swami's situation is, I ask him one question. And very often, has Mr. Swami not intervened and written on issues to Rajapaksa in the past? Has he not met Mr. Rajapaksa in the past at an individual level? At each time that he has met Mr. Rajapaksa to lobby on different issues, has he done so on behalf of the government of India? No, he has used his own good offices to do so. Now the lives of 5 fishermen is at stake. My question to Subramaniam Swami is, does he believe, and he has the choice of ducking us, but I repeat the question 1,000 times for his benefit, does he believe the Sri Lankan government is lying? Does he believe the Sri Lankan government is lying? Does he believe the Sri Lankan government is lying?
Let me answer that question.
Does he believe the Sri Lankan government is lying?
You coward, don't run away.
Does he believe the Sri Lankan government is lying?
I think this will do, yeah.
Does he believe that?
Okay. This goes on for about another 18 minutes, but I think, okay, but I think you get the general picture. This is communication. People are talking, trying to find out supposedly the truth. Is he lying? But do you think much information is getting transmitted? So one reason could be, again, that we are trying to have dialogue on an issue that we totally are sort of at loggerheads with. Now, can we do better? So one possibility is, yes, find a common dimension. So many people talk about things around, golf diplomacy, cricket diplomacy. Right. It's obviously gone to the... They must have changed. Never mind. I'll tell you what it is. It's taking to the... yes, here, yeah. That's cool, yeah. Okay, so at the height of a lot of tensions between India and Pakistan, India and Pakistan reached the semi-finals of a cricket match, and then India's then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh invited the Pakistani Prime Minister and the Pakistani President to watch the India-Pakistani match in Mohali. This was a good example of starting some kind of dialogue on an issue that people kind of agree with. I mean, I'm sure the Indian Prime Minister and the Pakistani Prime Minister did not agree on who they would like to win the match, but they certainly agreed that cricket is one thing that they both love. Now, does this work? I mean, does this kind of cricket diplomacy work, and does it lead to meaningful dialogue on other dimensions? We don't know, but one reason why this may work is that once communication starts on this common dimension, information on other dimensions may get updated. It could be that the two prime ministers talking to each other find that actually there is much that is common between the two countries. It's not that they didn't know it, but it comes to the forefront. And actually there are things about each other that they trust. And it might be to their advantage, including sometimes their political advantage, to make peace. I mean, it's an idea that politicians increase conflict, and I argue sometimes that they do. But sometimes it is to their electoral advantage to say that they brought home the peace. And so therefore starting dialogue on a non-controversial dimension may allow communication to continue as new issues come up that are perhaps not even so polarizing between the countries. Now, this is a conjecture, and I think it would be really nice, and given we have so many brilliant experimentalists in the audience, wouldn't it be great to test this experimentally? So pick subjects, and subjects who differ from each other, on the policy scale, and then you first have them talking about a dimension that they agree with, say cricket or golf or something, and then having a dialogue about the dimension that they have very different priors with, versus same subjects of experiments talking only on the dimension of conflict, and see in which cases you reach resolution if you do. I hypothesize that you would in the case where you have a communication on the dimension that you agree with, but again, that's something for us to test. Right. Now, here's an example of, if you like, bipartisan agreement in a time of great polarization. Now, the US Republicans and Democrats are highly polarized. I mean, they don't seem to agree on anything, including the fact that they need to get a budget done, right? But in spite of that, they managed to pass a criminal justice reform on a bipartisan basis a couple of months ago, and it occurred through influence groups from the left and the right. So the Koch brothers, who opposed everything that Obama did, they funded a movement to prevent this overcrowding of prisons and prevent this, to sort of reduce these disparities in sentencing in the US with left liberal organizations like the American Civil Liberties Organization. Now, why did this happen? It happened because in spite of a lot of prior polarization in belief, so the Koch brothers believed that in general government is a force for evil and looked for limited government, versus the left liberals who push for ever expanding government, they all agreed that the amount of money spent on prisons is not a good use of the government budget. They all agreed that sentences are disproportionately long and that something needs to be done. It could be that the right-wing people were more concerned about the overreach of government and budgetary issues, and the right were more concerned about that, and the left were more concerned about issues around disparities in sentencing between racial groups. But nonetheless, they found this extreme problem on which they had a common agreement and came to a solution. That's also the hope, that you might ultimately find a solution, because whether you believe in Brexit or you don't believe in Brexit, you might not believe in no-deal Brexit, and therefore you might at the last minute come together and come to a common ground. So I think we need to start well, maybe too optimistic, but anyway, we need to start finding common ground and evidence and problems we agree that needs to be solved to avoid bad outcomes. Common values. Now, the fact that we need to find a common dimension, would make me wonder, well, should we therefore try to search for or inculcate a set of common values? Would that help in reducing polarization, or should we instead face more exposure to divergent viewpoints? I mean, what is going to reduce polarization? And this has policy implications, because if you believe that it's about inculcating common values, then you might be more interested in thinking about mandated courses in sort of civics and what living in a Western liberal society is. You might be more interested in perhaps nationalism lectures. I remember a French politician's blank was that every child must be made to sing the national anthem and so on and so forth. That's your common values. On the other hand, if you think, well, no, it's actually exposure to divergent viewpoints, which is what helps people engage in meaningful dialogue, then you might be more interested in lessons in multiculturalism and so on and so forth, which is essentially a reframing of the question, what sort of society do we want? And it depends on what your objective function is, of course, but what sort of society do you think at least has lower polarization or is more progressive in whatever dimension you believe in? I mean, is it a melting pot where different cultures and ideologies mix? So, which is sort of the American idea that you come with different cultures and so on and so forth, you melt and you become American? Or is it a salad bowl where you have different cultures and you form a kind of mosaic, if you like, or where everybody retains their individual culture? What sort of society should one aspire for? And or put another way, what do these two different societies have in regards to how polarized they are? Now, while we don't know the answer, I mean, people have thought about this, there are a couple of interesting points to note. We know that forced exposure doesn't help, right? So we said, talking in different divergent viewpoints and so on. But if you force people to listen to things that they don't necessarily want to listen to, that's not going to help. There's a lot of evidence that right-wing people get more right-wing after listening to left-wing news and vice versa. Okay? So clearly it has to occur by things other than just mandating, let's do this, let's do that. And it leaves us with empirical challenges which are quite complicated. I mean, is a society that is diverse in some sense more polarized? We don't know. Does the degree of diversity matter? I mean, it's not very clear what diversity is. Is it like maybe having 3 big groups which are very diverse versus lots of small groups across the political spectrum? What leads to more polarization? And there are issues of what economists call reverse causality, something our students always grapple with, which is cause and effect. Suppose we find that diverse societies are less polarized. Is it happening because the society is less polarized simply because it's more diverse and people are left in peace? Or are diverse societies more correlated with societies which are liberal in other dimensions, and that is what is driving the lack of polarization? Complicated empirical challenges, and therefore it complicates the issue of whether we should aim for a melting pot or a salad bowl. Conflict versus polarization, and now it's getting even more speculative. What sort of structure actually incentivizes progress? And now you can define progress as you want. If your progress is high GDP, that's progress. If your progress is an equal society, that's progress. Whatever is your metric of progress, what kind of societal structure or what kind of societal diversity versus homogeneity incentivizes progress? And even if we know that a certain societal structure does, are these consistent with individual incentives? In other words, would the political class encourage such a society? Because after all, there's work showing that leaders may sometimes thrive on polarization if they're electorally successful. Why would they ever want to reduce that? Can we progress in spite of polarization? Because there's a worry that polarization leads to a lot of conflict across classes, which has societal costs. Now, for what it is worth, and I'm making a few conjectures, I think the type of conflict matters. Because whatever we think, I don't think uniformity of ideas or uniformity of beliefs is in any way progress. In fact, I think progress occurs through the conflict of ideas. And so like everything else, there's probably an optimal degree of conflict. So while conflict of ideas therefore advances society, only when there is a dialogue between these conflict of ideas and sort of the better idea comes out through this dialogue. What polarization of prior beliefs does is actually it impedes this conflict of ideas. If you start by believing that I'm right and this person is sort of the devil incarnate, and then you try to have this sort of discussion about ideas, you don't have a true conflict of ideas with the better idea winning. Yeah? So there is an optimal degree of conflict which is good, and I think the prior polarization in society has something to do with whether the conflict of ideas is good or bad for society. It's a bit like what Lipset said in 1959, that inherent in all democratic system is a constant threat, the group conflicts which are democracy's lifebloods, that's the conflict of ideas if you like, may solidify to the point where they threaten to disintegrate society. Okay, so now, are we in that age? Can we do anything about it? Am I optimistic? Well, I'm kind of optimistic because I sort of believe what was said in The Ascent of Man. There are many gifts that are unique in man, but at the center of them all, the root from which all knowledge grows, lies the ability to draw conclusions from what we see to what we do not see, to move our minds to space and time, and to recognize ourselves in the past on the steps of the present. Now, it might sometimes seem hidden in this kind of polarized society that we think we live in, but I'm sure there are triggers which would enable us to revive our rational hats on and reason, and that's why I'm kind of optimistic. And what do I actually think about sort of conflict and so on and so forth? I'm going to end here, and it also gives me a chance to quote from Man and Superman. I like George Bernard Shaw, not because I agree with him, but I think he writes beautifully. And also some of these quotes sort of show how dated I am. Never mind. Right. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. So I would say, let's all activate our unreasonable selves. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I was at the beginning you said that you were going to make a lot of conjectures and you don't have to prove things, but you forgot that you've got questions, Sid. So
I'll make some further conjectures then.
So, colleagues, in the spirit of being invited to be unreasonable, who would like to go first with the first question to Sid? Yes, over here.
Hi, Sid. Thanks for an exciting talk. My question pertains to the echo chamber and polarization point that you mentioned, which has received a lot of limelight recently. And these the social media giants like Facebook and Twitter have received a lot of flack for it. And your presentation focused on us as consumers to inform us of the various forces at play here. But do you think in this entire discourse, we are forgetting a very important third party, which is the government? Do you think there is a potential contribution there, or should the state be left out of this entire business of preventing echo chambers or nudging consumers towards a lesser polarized state? So what is your take on that?
I mean, really good question. I mean, first of all, I agree that I kind of look at this mainly from the point of view of consumers. But I think governments are important, right? I mean, that's why I had this example of a dialogue between the Indian Prime Minister and the Pakistani Prime Minister. And I think governments have a duty to reduce some of this. And now, how do they do that? Because you're kind of trading off other things which are really important, like privacy and so on and so forth, if you try to regulate. I would rather that governments nudge. So, let's all encourage people to be civil and watch India-Pakistan cricket matches without it becoming a shouting match about the morals of the two countries and so on and so forth. So governments, again, can encourage civil discourse. By example, the debates in Parliament don't always seem to point to the government as a great leader in encouraging civil discourse. And I think, and that's where I'm sort of torn. I'm not sure what the government should be encouraging, and that's partly why I said there are all these speculations and conjectures, because we are not sure what sort of society we aspire to be, which will actually reduce echo chambers, and how it links to diversity. That's an open question, and maybe something as a PhD student you can tackle.
Okay, other questions, colleagues? Yes, yeah.
So firstly, congratulations, Sid. It's a pleasure to be here. So my question comes, as you know, me as a political scientist. So you started off by talking about the kind of Downsian approach, one-dimensional.
Yeah.
And in a sense, one could argue that polarization is a good example of, if I can use the language of political science, an example of cumulative cleavages. So it's where divisions in society of essentially a series of them accumulate to kind of encourage polarization. So a political scientist might say, well, the real response is actually to think about the cross-cutting cleavages. So the way to deal with polarization is to actually maybe focus on those issues which cut across. And I could perhaps be challenging and say, you've picked India, you've picked the United States, you picked Brazil, you picked the UK. Part of that is the structure of those institutional frameworks that they have. So if you have a different kind of electoral system, a different institutional framework in a kind of Leibnizian sense, it could deal with it. But also it's about maybe encouraging those issues which cross-cut rather than cumulative. So it's part of the solution to maybe find the issues, maybe not just cricket, but other kinds of issues which can cut across rather than be cumulative cleavages.
Yeah, That's really an excellent idea, and I guess it's sort of the issue that you're trying to solve, right? I mean, if you're trying to solve tensions between India and Pakistan, you might be looking for things which are common to those countries. If you're trying to solve a global conflict, you'd be looking more at the kind of issues, cross-cutting issues that you are. So I'd like to take a sort of micro approach to this, saying that really depends on the type of issue and the type of polarization that you're trying to solve. Yeah, I'll keep it short. You know, we could really discuss this for a long time because it's an excellent question.
Okay, thank you. Other questions, colleagues? Yes, at the back over here, and then we'll go over here for the next one.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, the lecture. Do you think that the nature of legitimacy of political systems has changed? That in the environment now there is less acceptance of the right of state to act on behalf of others?
I'm not sure that there's a good yes or no answer to it. I think it depends on who you ask, and I think there is. Just as anything else, there is a polarization of beliefs about how much the state can or cannot act on behalf of the citizens. On the one hand, I might be inclined to say yes, because a lot of people would say the state loses legitimacy in many instances, which has actually led to the rise of extremist politicians. On the other hand, you see these very ambitious proposals from coming from the new left, which implicitly trusts the state with a lot more than we would ever do. So it's, I think it again depends on who you ask. It depends on sort of the initial beliefs, because, in some of these new Green Deals and so on and so forth, we are actually asking the state to intervene in almost every aspect of our lives. Now, it could be that the left believe that it's truly what we need, but it sort of assumes some legitimacy of the state to be able to deliver some of these issues.
We had our colleague here. There's a microphone just over here.
Sorry.
Thank you. I just wanted to go back to your point about uniformity of ideas toward in the middle of your talk. And it made me think about corporate media in this country and how you could argue that there's a sort of lack of meaningful, or there's a kind of a rather narrow spectrum of opinion. And there's a sort of lack of meaningful analysis of other viewpoints. So an example of that is, and perhaps that could lead to extremism. So, for example, you hear the terms hard left. Yeah. And also hard right, sort of bandied around a lot, but without any real analysis of what those terms mean. Yeah. So does this create a sort of extreme environment where, basically, because people's opinions are untested?
Yeah. I think that's generally a problem with labels. The moment you label somebody hard left or hard right, you close your mind to the actual idea espoused by that person you call hard left and hard right. It becomes, oh, this guy, no, we don't want to hear. And unless you also happen to be sympathetic to the hard left or the hard right, you become totally closed to that idea, and therefore you just reject it out of hand. Now, where do these labels come from? And I think it's not an accident. I think part of these labels are a sort of way of creating conflict and polarization in society. I would like to kind of know more about, how did we develop some of these labels, and how did we develop some of these kind of ways of shutting out the actual viewpoints being espoused. That's itself an interesting agenda for research, but does that partly answer your question? Yeah, okay.
We've got time for one last quick question, and you were first. Suddenly everybody wants to ask a question, but there will be time afterwards over a drink. So you were first, yeah. The microphone's over here. Is that okay?
This is just clearing up a question, really. First of all, congratulations, Sid, on your becoming a professor. We are the tennis people. We're very proud of you. Well done.
You're gonna ask me.
Well done. Yes, excellent. So I just needed the echo chamber bit cleared up. If you could just enlighten us on what that meant, I'd be really pleased.
Yeah. So echo chamber is basically, so the idea is that if you can choose sort of to consort with people of your kind, then you're hearing opinions which reflects or echoes your initial beliefs. And, you know, and there are a lot of reasons why people tend to do that. I mean, we have a lot of people who do behavioral economics who would talk about conformity bias and so on and so forth. Basically, it's the idea that I don't want to wake up in the morning and get angry, and therefore I kind of listen to things which I kind of mostly agree with, and, you know, maybe occasional divergences. So an echo chamber is basically, if you like, a group or a collection where you're hearing echoes of the same viewpoint.
It's time to come to an end. I want to thank everybody for coming. You've got a great audience, Sid, and it's great to see people from different parts of your life. You've obviously got lots of hidden talents that, that we can discover more about. And people will have a chance to talk with Sid and also to each other as soon as we've finished, because there's drinks and nibbles and stuff outside. But can I conclude? Thank you, those our colleagues in COS who've organised this event. But particularly, Sid, thank you. You gave us a very stimulating talk. There was lots of wonderful concepts in there about common values. And I think for me, I really liked the way that you finished it all by being an optimist. So on behalf of us all, thank you and congratulations.